Okay, Laura. Arc 1 blew my mind. I get that I create my reality with my beliefs. But now I have a bigger question. Who is the I that's doing the creating? When I say I create my reality, who exactly is talking? Is it just this body, this personality, or is there more to me than I realize?
Oh, I love that we're starting here because that is exactly the right question to be asking right now. It is the absolute natural next step on this journey for you. And to answer it, I want to share two things with you to really set our foundation for today's deep dive.
Okay, I'm ready.
First, there's a quote from Seth Speaks. He says, verbatim, "You are not a physical being having a spiritual experience. You are a spiritual being having a physical experience."
Wow. Yeah, I've heard variations of that out in the world, but hearing it straight from the source hits differently.
It really does.
Mm.
And then he expands on this in the nature of the psyche with this, well, this incredible definition. He says, the psyche is a gestalt of aware energy in which your own identity resides.
Okay, a gestalt of aware energy. That immediately sounds so much more massive than just me sitting here in this chair, looking out through these two eyes and trying to figure out what's for dinner.
Exactly. It completely shatters the smallness we usually feel. And that's really our mission for you today. We are beginning our exploration into the invisible self. We're going to map out the larger you that exists entirely beyond your physical senses.
Which I think is so needed. Because right now, if you're listening, you might actually feel the heavy burden of that phrase, creating your own reality. You might be sitting in your car thinking, oh no, my fragile, stressed out ego has to micromanage the entire universe.
Right, like it's all on your shoulders to magically manifest everything perfectly.
Yeah, it sounds exhausting. So our goal today is to show you why your outer ego is not the sole creator and really introduce you to the vast, incredibly capable system that is actually supporting you behind the scenes.
It takes so much pressure off when you understand the actual mechanics of it. So let's start right where Seth starts, with his diagnosis of the multidimensional self. Let's unpack that word you just brought up, gestalt.
Yeah, because usually when I hear gestalt, I think of like a piece of music, right?
That's a great way to look at it.
You have individual notes, but when you play them together, the melody is the gestalt. It's an entirely new entity that exists because of the relationship between the parts. So, is Seth saying my soul is like a melody?
That is a beautifully accurate way to describe the source material, actually. In Seth Speaks, he makes it very clear that the soul, or the entity, is not a closed system. And this is, well, it's a radical departure from how most of us were raised to think about the soul.
Totally. I mean, we tend to imagine the soul as this static, glowing orb of light trapped inside our chest, just waiting for us to die so it can float up to some afterlife and take a nap.
Exactly, like a spiritual organ that you carry around but don't really interact with. But Seth says the soul is an action. It is not a thing. He calls it a powerhouse of creativity that shoots out in all directions.
So it's active, it's doing things constantly.
Endlessly active. It is an open spiritual system. So returning to your Gestalt concept, think about the sheer biology of your physical body for a moment. You, listening to this right now, are currently operating a biological Gestalt of trillions of individual living cells.
Right.
Each one of those cells has its own inner comprehension. It has its own boundaries, its own life cycle, its own intelligence. I mean, millions of them are dying and being born inside you right at this very second.
But I don't feel like a walking colony of bacteria and tissue. When my body needs food, I don't say, my stomach lining requires nutrients. I just say, I am hungry.
Exactly. The overarching identity, the you, is the one experiencing the unified result of trillions of independent actions. And Seth applies that exact same structural logic to the soul.
Okay, so how does that translate to my mind then?
Your current personality, the conscious mind you're using right now to listen to us, the ego that worries about paying the bills and, gets frustrated in traffic, is like one of those single cells within the larger gestalt of your soul.
That is wild to think about.
You maintain your absolute individual integrity. You have your specific I amness, but simultaneously, you are part of a vastly larger psychic organization that is constantly feeding you energy and information.
Okay, this is where I have to push back a little bit because if I am just a single cell in this massive spiritual gestalt, it kind of makes me feel small. It almost sounds like I'm not the one running the show.
I can totally see why it feels that way at first.
Right. If my conscious ego isn't the one doing the heavy lifting of creating my reality, who actually is? Who is the I that's doing the work in the engine room?
To explain that, Seth divides the self into working parts, though he always cautions that there are no hard borders in reality. It's all fluid. Yeah. But basically, there is the outer ego, which is the self you identify with right now.
The me that pays taxes.
Yes, the
Yeah.
taxpaying self. And then there's the inner ego, or the inner self.
Oh.
The inner self is the part of the gestalt that exists entirely outside of physical time and space, yet it is intimately, continuously involved in keeping you alive within it.
So the inner self is the one actually operating the machinery.
Think about the mechanics of your existence for just a second. Your outer ego, the part of you that knows your name and your social security number, does not know how to pump your blood.
No, definitely not.
It does not know how to synthesize vitamin D from sunlight. It has absolutely no idea how to fire the exact, unimaginably complex sequence of neurons required for you to comprehend the English words I am speaking right now.
That's completely true. I mean, if my outer ego were suddenly put in charge of consciously beating my heart, I would forget and die in 5 minutes because I got distracted by a text message.
We all would. The outer ego is entirely unequipped for the actual maintenance of physical reality. And Seth points this out repeatedly. The inner self is the part of you that actually translates spirit into flesh. It is the inner self that lovingly forms your physical body out of the psychological energy of your beliefs.
Wait, pause. Let's not just gloss over that. Forms your physical body out of energy, because that's the part that always trips people up. Sounds like magic. How does a thought or a belief actually become a physical cell?
It's not magic, it's physics. It's just a broader physics than we currently have the instruments to measure. In the early chapters of Seth Speaks, he explains that thoughts and emotions are actually composed of electromagnetic energy units.
Okay, so they have actual substance.
Yes, they have an actual measurable reality in inner dimensions.
Okay.
The inner self acts as a transformer. It takes a highly concentrated psychological energy of your beliefs, desires, and fears, and it slows the vibration of that energy down. It translates it.
Almost like a step-down transformer on a power line.
Exactly like that. Just as a radio receiver translates invisible radio waves into audible sound, the inner self translates invisible psychological energy into physical matter. It manages the brilliant subconscious ballet of your organs, your breathing, your cellular regeneration. It is constantly projecting the physical camouflage you call a body.
Ah, physical camouflage.
Yeah.
That's a very specific Seth term. What exactly does he mean by the camouflage universe?
He means that the physical world, the desk you're touching, the car you're driving, even your own physical brain, is not the primary reality. It is a camouflage.
Meaning it's hiding something else.
Yes, it is a highly specialized, localized expression of a much deeper, energetic reality. It's a stage set. And the inner self is the director behind the curtain, constantly building and maintaining the stage set so that the outer ego can have a place to play, act, and learn.
Which brings me to my next question, because this always bugs me. If the inner self is this brilliant, multidimensional powerhouse that knows how to turn energy into matter, that knows the entire blueprint of reality, why did it even bother creating this bumbling outer ego?
That is the million-dollar question.
Right. It feels totally redundant. Why doesn't the inner self just live the life itself? Why create an ego that gets anxious, forgets where it put its keys, and stresses out about the future?
Because the inner self is too vast to experience the sharp, pointed focus of linear physical time. Imagine trying to thread a needle while simultaneously listening to 10 different symphonies, solving complex mathematical equations, and remembering every moment of your childhood all at once.
I would just drop the needle.
Exactly. You wouldn't be able to function in this specific environment. The inner self is constantly aware of your past existences, your simultaneous lives, and what Seth calls your probable realities.
Hold on. Probable realities. Are we talking about a multiverse here? What does Seth mean by that in this context?
It is very similar to the concept of the multiverse. Seth teaches in The Unknown Reality that every time you make a major decision, the choices you didn't make don't just disappear into nothingness. They are actualized in probable systems of reality.
So there's a version of me living out the career I didn't choose.
Yes. And the inner self is overseeing all of these lines of probability simultaneously. It is gathering experience from all of them. So if the inner self tried to directly interact with a physical coffee cup in your kitchen, the sheer volume of its awareness would shatter the illusion of time and space.
Ah, I see. So it needs a focusing lens.
Precisely. The outer ego is a highly specialized, absolutely vital probe. It is designed to manipulate strictly within three-dimensional space and linear time. It is the part of the soul that looks outward.
It encounters events sequentially.
Yes, it makes decisions based on cause and effect. It feels the texture of the camouflage reality. The ego is not a mistake or a downgrade. It is a brilliant creation.
Okay, so if I'm trying to visualize this relationship, let's use a hand. if my current ego, the outer self, is just the tip of my index finger?
Right, the part that is actually touching the desk, feeling the heat of the coffee mug, experiencing the sharp sensations of the physical world.
Then the inner self would be the palm of the hand. It's the central hub. It's coordinating the movement of the finger, sending the blood flow to it, holding the structure together, but it's not the part directly pressing against the physical object.
That is a perfect metaphor.
Ah.
And to complete it, the entity, or the oversoul, would be the entire hand and the arm stretching back into the invisible dimensions.
So my inner self is like the higher self people talk about, but more integrated.
Yes, it is vastly more integrated, and that is a crucial distinction we need to make for you listening right now. In many spiritual traditions, the higher self is treated as something distant, remote, and inherently better than you.
Yeah, it's often portrayed as almost a separate deity that you have to pray to or like meditate for decades in an ashram just to catch a fleeting glimpse of.
Right, the higher self is treated as the wise master on the mountain, and the ego is treated as the dirty, sinful peasant that needs to be disciplined.
Which just creates so much guilt.
It does. And Seth is completely stripping away that separation and that hierarchy. The inner self is not a distant, judgmental God figure sitting on a cloud evaluating your moral performance. It is intimately, biologically, psychologically yours.
It's literally on your team.
It is your team.
Yeah.
It is the direct source of your spontaneous impulses, your intuitions, your sudden creative ideas. It is the part of you that inherently knows the way, and it is trying to communicate with your outer ego every single second of the day.
But the ego doesn't always listen, does it? I mean, in the material, Seth famously calls the ego a jealous god. What does he mean by that?
It means the ego wants its interests served exclusively, and it only wants to acknowledge the reality it can see, hear, and touch. Because the outer ego is designed to focus on the camouflage universe, it has developed a tendency to block out anything that isn't physical.
It gets tunnel vision.
Extreme tunnel vision. We have culturally trained the ego to put on incredibly thick blinders. It thinks it is the captain of the ship, mostly because it's the one standing at the wheel getting splashed by the physical waves.
And it looks around, sees no one else on deck, and says, well, I must be the only one here.
Exactly. But its very existence relies entirely on the inner self, working down in the engine room, keeping the ship afloat.
Okay, this all sounds beautifully philosophical. Intellectually, sitting here in a comfortable room, I'm nodding along, I get the finger in the palm. But I want to bring this down to earth for a minute, because grasping this conceptually as a theory is one thing, but waking up on a Tuesday morning and actually living as a multidimensional gestalt is another.
Oh, absolutely. The theory is easy, the practice is messy.
And nobody illustrates that intense, gritty struggle better than Jane Roberts herself.
Yes. If we want to understand how this actually plays out in a human life, we have to look at Jane's journey. Because her entire experience with the Seth material was really just a long, intense, often terrifying awakening to her own invisible self.
I think it's so important for you, the listener, to understand where Jane started. Because Jane was not some levitating mystic. When all this began in late 1963, she was a poet and a writer living in Elmira, New York. She was deeply skeptical of anything occult.
She really was. She wasn't meditating or seeking spiritual enlightenment. In fact, she felt incredibly trapped by her physical circumstances.
She was dealing with constant, grinding money struggles with her husband, Rob, and more importantly, she suffered from severe physical limitations.
Yes, she had early onset rheumatoid arthritis that caused her intense pain and stiffness. She felt completely at the mercy of her failing physical body.
And psychologically, she was heavily guarded. She had been raised strictly Catholic, eventually rejected the church, and adopted this highly rational, almost cynical scientific worldview. She believed that human identity was entirely confined to the physical brain and ended abruptly at death.
She was a quintessential modern Western intellectual. She believed the ego was the pinnacle of consciousness, and everything else was just biological machinery or Freudian repressed trauma.
Right. And then the inciting incident happens. She and Reed decide to mess around with a Ouija board. And again, this wasn't a seance. They weren't trying to contact the dead.
Not at all.
Jane just wanted to get some psychological insights and ideas for a fiction book she was writing about ESP.
It was almost a joke to them initially. They approached it like a parlor trick. But then the pointer started moving, spelling out messages that were far too coherent to be random muscle twitches. And soon, the phenomenon began to bypass the board entirely.
She started feeling it in her head.
Yes, Jane began anticipating the words in her mind before they were spelled out. Then she described feeling this sudden, massive, undeniable rush of energy hitting her physically, expanding her consciousness so rapidly she felt she might be losing her mind. And suddenly she began speaking the words aloud. That was the emergence of the Seth personality.
Let's really put ourselves in her shoes for a second. Can you imagine the absolute shock for someone with her strict, rational, materialistic worldview? Suddenly, she is sitting in her living room in a trance state, channeling a multidimensional entity who is calmly telling her that everything she believes about reality is backward.
It was a profound psychological earthquake for her. It challenged every foundational belief she held.
That her identity is not bound by her ailing physical body? That her ego is just a tiny fraction of who she really is?
Through the hundreds of sessions that followed over the years, Jane gradually had to face the terrifying reality that the Jane identity, the woman worrying about the rent in Elmira, the woman whose joints ached, was merely one single focus of a vastly larger consciousness.
There is a phrase Seth used early on that always sticks with me. He would frequently refer to her not just as Jane, but as the Jane of whom you are a part.
Yes, the Jane of whom you are a part.
That phrasing just stops you in your tracks. It completely reverses the hierarchy we are so used to. It implies that the Jane sitting there is just a fragment, a localized projection of a much larger, overarching Jane entity that exists outside of time.
It does, and this was not an easy transition for her to make. To understand why, we have to look at what Seth called her sinful self and her superhuman self-image. This is something I think everyone listening will relate to on a deep level.
I certainly do.
Jane had a powerful underlying tendency to believe that human nature at its core is inherently flawed and chaotic. This was a hangover from her Catholic upbringing. The idea of original sin, the idea that the flesh is weak and natural impulses are dangerous.
So she believed that if she didn't maintain strict rational control over herself at all times, she would spiral into chaos or immorality.
Exactly. She believed that her spontaneous impulses needed to be strictly policed by the rational ego. She had encased herself in this rigid, protective psychological armor. She felt she had to be perfect, that she had to save the world through her intellect alone, and that her natural, untamed energy was somehow wrong or untrustworthy.
And there is a direct correlation there with her physical body, right? Because in the Seth material, Seth explains that the physical body is the mirror of the inner psychological state.
It is a direct translation.
If the ego is terrified of the inner self's energy, if it tries to build walls to restrict the flow of spontaneous impulses, the physical body will literally manifest that rigidity.
That is the exact mechanism of her illness. Her severe arthritis was the literal physical manifestation of her ego clenching down, trying to block the vast expansive energy of her inner self. Her joints were stiffening because her psychological boundaries were too rigid. She was using her ego as a tyrant, tightly restricting her inner self out of pure fear.
Hearing how Jane struggled makes me realize I do the exact same thing. I mean, I lock up when I get an impulse. If I have a sudden creative urge that doesn't fit my logical plan for the day, my ego instantly shuts it down. That's impractical. We don't have time for that. That's a silly idea.
We all do it. We act like tyrants to our own inner selves.
So how did Jane break out of it? What was the turning point for her?
She had to learn painstakingly over years of trance sessions and personal reflection to trust the spontaneous impulses that seemed to come from beyond her conscious, reasoning mind. Seth constantly worked with her on this.
He was like a multi-dimensional therapist.
He really was. He kept telling her,
Yeah.
your impulses are the language of your inner self. They are the natural, vital connectors between the physical camouflage universe and the inner dimensions of reality. If you don't trust your impulses, you fundamentally do not trust the nature of your own life.
So what happened as she started to actually surrender to that? When she stopped fighting the current, stopped clenching her psychological muscles, and started letting the palm guide the finger?
Her life expanded in ways that completely defied her old logical worldview. First of all, her creativity exploded. The Seth books are not light reading.
No, they are incredibly dense.
They are complex, internally consistent, brilliant pieces of literature and philosophy. And she produced them verbally, in real-time trance states, without editing or notes. The sheer volume of material she allowed to flow through her is staggering.
And what about her physical symptoms? The arthritis?
Her health and vitality improved dramatically whenever she stopped restricting her natural energy. When she surrendered to the flow of her inner self, the literal physical inflammation in her body would subside.
That is amazing.
And when she got scared and let the ego clamp down again, the symptoms would flare up. It was a perfect real-time feedback loop, proving that her physical reality was being generated by her psychological relationship with her larger self.
Here is where I think this gets intensely relevant for you listening to us right now, because you might hear Jane's story and think, well, I don't want to become a psychic channeler. I don't want to lose my identity. But Jane didn't magically transform into a different person. She didn't lose her personality or become some blank, blissed out, hollow vessel.
Not at all. Her personality remained incredibly robust, fiery, and distinct until the end of her life.
Exactly. She became more of the person she already was. She tapped into this vast inner resource that was always there, waiting for the outer ego to just step out of the way a little bit.
That is the ultimate promise of this material. We need to be very clear about this. The inner self does not want to annihilate your ego. It does not want to absorb you so that you lose your individuality.
It built the ego on purpose.
Exactly. It created you. It wants to support you, to nourish you, to give you the data you need to navigate the physical world joyfully and effectively. The ego just has to take the blinders off and recognize the massive support system it already has.
Okay, so this brings us to the most important question. We've mapped out the multidimensional self. We've discussed the mechanics of the Gestalt. We've seen how Jane had to wrestle her own ego to allow that energy to flow. But what does this mean for you sitting there listening to us right now?
Right? How do we make this practical?
How do you actually stop acting like a tyrant to your own inner self today? How do we take off the blinders?
We have to move from theory to practical application. We need to introduce a technique that Seth hints at throughout these early books, which we will call noticing the larger self.
I am so ready for this because we can't just conceptualize the Gestalt academically. We have to experience the connection. If the inner self is always trying to send me data, how do I actually hear it? What are the channels of communication? Because I'm pretty sure my inner self isn't going to use a booming cinematic voice from the sky.
No, it rarely works like that because that would overwhelm the outer ego. Instead, as Seth explains in Seth Speaks, the inner self communicates through what he calls the inner senses. Just as you have outer physical senses, sight, sound, touch to navigate the camouflage of the physical world, you have inner senses designed to perceive the inner dimensions of reality.
But if I have inner senses, why don't I notice them? Why don't I walk around seeing multidimensional energy all day?
Because of the necessary biological mechanism we discussed earlier. The physical senses are explicitly designed to blot out other realities, so you can focus exclusively on this one. If you could consciously perceive the thoughts of everyone around you, or visually see the electromagnetic energy units forming your chair, you would never be able to successfully cross a busy street.
Oh yeah, sensory overload to the extreme.
The physical senses act as a filter, but beneath that filter, the inner senses act like a constant, high-speed internal communication system connecting you to the Gestalt. They translate inner data into terms your physical brain can process.
So what does that translation look like in my normal daily life? Are we just talking about gut feelings?
Gut feelings are a primary channel, yes, but it's also those sudden insights that seem to pop into your head fully formed. It's an unexpected urge to call an old friend you haven't thought of in 10 years, only to find out they desperately needed to talk to you right at that moment.
I love when that happens.
It's a spontaneous creative impulse to take a different route to work, which ends up helping you avoid a massive traffic accident. It's a meaningful coincidence or synchronicity where the outside physical world suddenly perfectly mirrors an internal thought you were just having.
Or what about when you're wrestling with a complex problem at work for days? You're grinding your gears, your ego is stressed to the max, trying to logic it out. Then you give up, step into the shower, stop thinking about it entirely, and bam, the perfect, elegant solution is just sitting there in your mind like a gift.
That is the classic example of inner ego communication. Your outer ego finally exhausted itself, quieted down, and took its tight grip off the steering wheel for 2 seconds. And in that tiny gap of relaxation, the inner self slipped the answer through the inner senses and into your conscious awareness.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate here. How do you know the difference between a genuine communication from your inner self and just a random neurotic thought generated by an anxious ego? If I get a sudden impulse to quit my job and move to the woods, is that my inner self guiding me, or is that just my ego wanting to run away from a stressful deadline?
That is the exact question Jane Roberts struggled with, and Seth gives a very clear qualitative metric for this. Impulses from the inner self, channeled through the inner senses, always feel expansive.
Expansive, okay.
They feel life-affirming. They carry a sense of knowing or calm clarity, even if the action they suggest seems illogical to the outer ego. Neurotic ego thoughts, on the other hand, are driven by fear. They feel restrictive, anxious, and chaotic.
They usually have a tight, panicked feeling.
Yes. They're usually focused on avoiding pain rather than moving toward growth. The inner self does not communicate through panic. It communicates through vitality and inspiration.
That makes a lot of sense. The palm doesn't send panic to the finger, it just sends blood and direction.
Yeah.
So what is the actual practice here? When you, the listener, get one of those expansive signals today, when you feel that sudden knowing or a creative idea pops in your head, what are you supposed to do?
The practice is profound in its simplicity. You simply start acknowledging the receipt of the signal. When that impulse arises, instead of ignoring it or instantly analyzing it, you pause for just a moment. And internally, you say to yourself, that's my larger self communicating.
That's my larger self communicating. It's almost like giving credit where credit is due.
Exactly. And there is a strict rule for this practice, which is the hardest part for modern intellectuals. You do not analyze the message.
Oh, that's tough.
You do not judge it. You do not immediately pull out a spreadsheet and try to figure out how to monetize the creative idea. You don't psychoanalyze why you suddenly remember the smell of your grandmother's kitchen. You just acknowledge the receipt of the message.
Why is it so vitally important not to analyze it? What happens if I try to dissect the impulse?
The moment you start analyzing it, you have handed the data back to the outer ego. And remember, the outer ego is a jealous god. It wants to remain the sole authority. The ego will immediately start finding flaws.
Right, it'll say, oh, that gut feeling is just something you ate.
Or that sudden idea is totally impractical. We don't have the budget for that. Or that urge to call your friend is just a random firing of synapses. The ego tries to shut down the communication because the communication threatens its illusion of total control.
So by simply acknowledging the message without judgment, you are bypassing the ego's defense mechanisms.
Yes. You are building a conscious psychological bridge between the outer ego and the inner self. You are gently, consistently retraining your ego to accept that it's not alone in the universe. You are teaching it that it is safe to receive help from the vast resources of the Gestalt.
You are basically telling the ego, hey, the palm of the hand is sending us fresh blood and energy. Let's not argue with it. Let's just accept it and use it.
Precisely. And this brings to mind a quote from The Unknown Reality that perfectly encapsulates this shift in perspective. Seth is talking about how we perceive our own larger identity. And he says, verbatim, the unknown reality is unknown only because you believe it must be hidden. It is not hidden. It is simply not focused upon.
It is simply not focused upon. That line changes everything about how we approach spirituality.
It really does.
It means the larger self isn't hiding in some mystical, guarded dimension that we have to earn our way into through suffering or decades of meditation. It is right here. It is constantly broadcasting, intimately connected to our biology. We just have our dials tuned to the wrong frequency. We've been looking outward so intensely that we forgot how to look inward.
It is playing on the radio 24/7, but we have the volume turned all the way down because the noise of the physical camouflage world is so incredibly loud. Our practice is simply turning the dial slightly to raise the volume of the inner senses.
Okay, so let's help you turn that volume up right now. We want to give you a direct, actionable exercise to ground today's deep dive. We've unpacked the heavy philosophy, we've explored the mechanics of the Gestalt, we've seen how Jane Roberts fought and eventually surrendered to her larger identity. Now let's put this entirely to the test in your own life.
I think a 24-hour assignment is perfect for this. We want to demonstrate to you, physically and consciously, just how incredibly active your inner self is in your daily life once you actually decide to focus upon it. So here are the mechanics of the exercise you are going to do.
Listen closely.
For the next 24 hours, whenever you experience a gut feeling, a sudden insight, an unexpected memory popping into your head out of nowhere, or a spontaneous creative impulse, you simply pause.
And what do you say in that pause?
You silently say to yourself, "Message received. Thank you."
Message received. Thank you. It's so simple. It's literally just confirming delivery of a package from the palm to the finger.
Yes. But to make this tangible for your outer ego, which, let's face it, loves hard data, loves proof, and loves to see things in physical reality, you are going to keep track. I want you to keep a small note open in your phone or carry a scrap of paper and a pen in your pocket. Every single time you pause and say, "Message received, thank you," make a tally mark on that paper.
Just a simple line. Now, I can already see my own ego trying to hijack this exercise. If I get an impulse, my ego is going to want to write down exactly what the thought was. It's going to want to write a 3-page journal entry about the synchronicity and analyze what it means for my destiny. Why is it so important that we only make a tally mark?
Because the moment you try to write down the details of the message, You invite the ego back in to critique the validity of it. The ego will look at what you wrote and say, well, that wasn't a very profound message. That doesn't prove anything. The tally mark is completely objective. It is just a neutral record that a communication occurred. It satisfies the ego's need to record an event without giving the ego the material it needs to judge the event.
That is so incredibly smart. It completely outmaneuvers the jealous God. So what is the expected outcome of this exercise for the person listening right now? Because knowing how we usually operate, you might be thinking, I'm not psychic. I'll probably get 1 or 2 tally marks all day if I'm lucky.
What is endlessly fascinating about this exercise is the sheer volume of data you will collect. At the end of the day tomorrow, when you look at that piece of paper or your phone, you will be utterly surprised by the number of tally marks. Most people find they have 20, 30, or 40 marks.
Wow, that many.
Easily. You will have undeniable visual proof in your physical camouflage reality of exactly how often your larger self is reaching out to you, attempting to guide you, offering you insights, and feeding you energy. It is a profoundly validating experience.
It bypasses the ego's tendency to put those blinders on. Because the ego can look at 30 tally marks and it has to concede the point and has to say, oh, wow, okay, maybe I'm not doing this all by myself. Maybe I actually do have an entire vastly intelligent support system operating constantly beneath my conscious awareness.
It gently trains your conscious mind to accept support from the invisible self without feeling threatened or diminished by it.
Exactly. It relieves your ego of the completely impossible burden of being the sole creator, maintainer, and sustainer of your physical reality. When the ego realizes it has this backing, it can finally relax back into its proper, highly effective role as the brilliant, focused perceiver and actor in physical reality, safely supported by the infinite resources of the inner self.
And that relaxation changes everything.
I have to say, just spending this time deeply unpacking these concepts from Seth Speaks and the nature of the psyche, I already feel a profound shift in my own perspective. I feel tangibly less alone in my own head.
That's the magic of it.
It's like walking through a dark house your whole life thinking you're the only one there, and suddenly the lights flip on and you realize there's a whole, incredibly capable, deeply supportive team working behind the scenes for your benefit. You are not just this isolated, stressed-out outer ego trying to force the physical universe to bend to your will. You are the physical extension of a vast creative powerhouse.
You are the physical materialization of your own soul's deep desire to experience this specific, beautiful, textured reality. You are deeply known and deeply cherished by your own inner self. And once you begin to open those channels of communication, the actual lived nature of your physical life begins to change. The struggle diminishes, the desperate need to control every outcome fades, and the natural flow of creativity, vitality, and joy increases, just as it did for Jane Roberts.
This is just the beginning of understanding your own invisible self. We've established that the multidimensional inner self exists. We've unpacked the mechanics of the Gestalt and the camouflage universe, and we've given you a direct, practical way to start listening to the signals today. But there is a massive piece of the puzzle we haven't touched yet.
Oh, yes, there is.
We know the inner self is building the physical reality we walk around in, but where does it do the planning? How does it actually translate its energy into the specific daily events of our lives?
Next time, we explore one of the most fascinating aspects, the dream world, and how the inner self uses it to literally blueprint our physical reality before we even wake up.
Get out that piece of paper. Keep that tally going. Start noticing the larger you. Message received. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.